Welcome, everyone. It's really wonderful to engage with you. I'm Kate Andrews, CEO of NRM Regions Australia. Before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting you from today, which is the Yuin people. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, but I'd also like to thank First Australians for their care of country over the last tens of thousands of years and their fundamental and ongoing role and the knowledge that they share. Now, this workshop is an important one for us. We're transitioning from what has been a national working group in carbon farming to a broader communities of practice with a broader role. And as you'll all be aware, NRMs have been involved in carbon farming for well over a decade, inputting to legislation, policy, exploring the roles of NRM and actually engaging in carbon farming in different ways. So this is not a new start for us. But this series of 4 workshop sessions are a fundamental opportunity for us as we re-engage at the national level. We want to learn about the current state of play. We want to learn from what each other are doing. So we really want to hear from you and what you're doing, whether you're a formal speaker or not. It's a really important opportunity for us and hopefully for you to learn from each other. But we also really want to understand your needs. So what is it that we can be doing to help support you at that national level? Okay, so that leads me to a big thank you. And that thank you is to the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, because it's a contract we have with them that is supporting this work right now. It's a contract with NRM Regions Australia, and it's to work with our regions, basically our members, to build capacity to support local communities to engage and participate in the Emissions Reduction Fund and carbon farming, but also to facilitate the alignment of ERF projects with NRM plans, something which already sits in the legislation. So to kick off, I'd like to introduce 2 very crucial people who are going to make this all work, Trish and Mark from Collab Forge. They're going to be making things tick and keeping us on time. But then I'd like to thank and hand over to Rachel Clark. Rachel, I'm very excited to say, is our new part-time knowledge broker in carbon farming who is funded through the DISA contract. And Rachel comes to us with a background in farming, in community engagement, in communication. She's got a great broad background going all the way back to, I think, being a land care facilitator at the beginning. So she gets this stuff. And I'm really lucky to have someone on board to help us push these things along. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel to be our guide through this and the other sessions. And welcome, Rachel. Glad to have you, by the way.
Thanks very much, Kate. Thanks very much for that very kind welcome and introduction. I'd also like to really thank everyone who's participating in the workshop today and in sessions tomorrow, as well as all of the people that I've spoken to and that have offered to present and be involved in the workshops. I've really enjoyed getting to know some of you a bit through over the phone and email and so on. So I really thank you for your support since I started in the role. I'm really looking forward to taking the role forward and having the opportunity to build knowledge together and see how we can increase our engagement with carbon farming in the ERF and achieve really good outcomes for natural resource management regions. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. I'm on Ngunnawal land here today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. For everyone's information, I also just want to note a few housekeeping sort of things. So we are recording the session today. And also we'll be holding questions until the end. So we're going to go through all the speakers and then we'll be holding questions. So if you've got questions that are popping into your head while we're going through our talks, could you please pop them into the chat? And so that will give us the opportunity to make sure that they all get addressed at the end. So we'll have half an hour for questions and answers at the end. As Kate mentioned, the purpose of this session is to give people an opportunity to have an overview of the current market and operating context, as well as the authorising environment for carbon farming in Australia at the moment. But before moving on to our main speaking program, I'd really like to thank Beth Adams from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources for being here. And I'm just going to hand briefly to Beth to do a bit of a welcome and a quick overview of the department's role and interest in this work. So thanks, Beth. Pass to you for a second.
Thanks, Rachel. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land at my location, and to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. So as Kate and Rachel mentioned, I work in the Department of Industry, Science and Energy. We have responsibility for the policy and legislation that supports the Emission Reduction Fund. It's great to see so many NRM organisations here and engaging on carbon farming. I think there's a really valuable role that the NRM organisations can play in supporting their methods to realise carbon abatement opportunities. So I'm sure most of you are already aware of the Emissions Reduction Fund. It is the Australian government program to incentivise businesses to cut the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they create and to undertake activities that store carbon. So my department's role includes advising the Minister in his role of making the methods, which are the rules that guide the different activities to sequester carbon or reduce emissions. Our role also includes advising the Minister as he sets priorities for what new methods should be developed. Now, the development of those methods and the administration of the Emissions Reduction Fund is then done by the Clean Energy Regulator, who I understand will be speaking to you shortly. Now, we have a keen interest in this workshop because, as Kate and Rachel mentioned, we've contracted NRM Regions Australia to work with NRM organisations to improve knowledge sharing arrangements and simplify access to trusted information on reducing emissions for Australia's land managers. This work came about because access to trusted information was identified as a barrier for land managers taking up abatement opportunity. Because NRM organisations are existing bodies holding huge degrees of trust within their communities, they're a great existing avenue through which land managers could access trusted information and knowledge sharing. Our contract with NRM Regions Australia is really intended to position NRM organisations to be the source of support for their farming communities. And we look forward to seeing the outcomes of this workshop as a step along the way for that. At the same time, we see the project as a two-way communication avenue. So as well as delivering information to land managers, it provides an avenue for NRM organisations and land managers to feed information and views on Emissions Reduction Fund and NRM back to us, which from my department's perspective is useful when we're looking at setting method development priorities or advising the Minister as he sets some. Ultimately, our goal is that access to trusted information, that's what we're trying to achieve, and the resulting informed capacity of land managers, and that will increase participation in the carbon market and the realisation of abatement opportunities for land managers. So that's all I wanted to say on that. I think I'll hand back to Rachel now.
Thanks very much, Beth. That was really interesting and great to get the overview about the perspective on the two-way information flow and how we can work together to sort of increase participation in the scheme. So we're going to move on to our speakers now, and we're just going to run through all the speakers first, and then, as I said before, we're going to have 30 minutes Q&A at the end. So the first speaker we've got today is Melanie Ford from the Clean Energy Regulator. Mel is leading the work on the development of methods with the Clean Energy Regulator now, and this is a bit of a new space for the Clean Energy Regulator since last year. So I'm going to pass to Mel so that she can give an overview of the new role and an update on some of the information that might be that's hopefully useful and relevant to NRM regional organisations. So just pass to you now, Mel.
Okay, thanks, Rachel, and I'll just try and share my screen. As Rachel said, my name is Melanie Ford. I head up the Method Development Branch of the Clean Energy Regulator, and we're based in Canberra on Ngunnawal country. So today I've been asked to give a bit of an overview of the Emissions Reduction Fund and talk about some of the opportunities for carbon farming in Australia. I understand in the room today there's some people that are, very expert in this space and others that are sort of looking for a higher level overview. So hopefully we can sort of talk more about the detail in the Q&A and that you find this useful. So what is the Emissions Reduction Fund? Well, it's a voluntary scheme that the Australian government uses that provides incentives to individual farmers, landholders and businesses to undertake activities that reduce their greenhouse gas emissions or store carbon within vegetation or soils. When you undertake these activities, you can earn what we call Australian carbon credit units, and each ACCU represents a tonne of emissions stored or avoided. These ACCUs are a tradable product that you can sell either to the Australian government to state governments or to private market buyers. And what they really represent is an additional revenue source that landholders can access through the Emissions Reduction Fund. The Australian government is at the moment the key purchaser of these units in the market, but there is a really growing voluntary market with lots of companies and businesses really seeking to find ways in which they can demonstrate a commitment to sustainable activities, and the purchase of ACCUs is one way in which they can do that. The Emissions Reduction Fund has been around since the early 2010s, and we have just under 1,000 projects registered all throughout Australia. In total, these projects have contributed to reducing Australia's emissions by about 93 million tonnes, so it is a relatively large program. Projects in the land sector are by far the majority of projects that have come forward, with many of these project types being project opportunities that protect native vegetation, and there's also a range of opportunities in the agriculture space in soil carbon as well as savanna burning as well. There are also other methods across the industrial sectors as well, but as I said, the land sector is by far the highest number of registered projects and also the largest contributor to abatement under this program. So under the Emissions Reduction Fund, in order to be issued ACCUs, you have to follow what we call a method, which is essentially the rule book that you need to follow in order to run a project and earn emissions reductions credits. These are legislative instruments, which means that they are effectively backed by the government. In terms of carbon farming activities, there's probably four main types. The first is, as I mentioned, storing carbon in vegetation systems. So these methods either involve protecting existing native vegetation, establishing new environmental plantings, or allowing native vegetation to regrow. These methods don't necessarily require that you completely destock a property, but they do require that you manage your property in a way in which the vegetation is allowed to regrow. The second main type is the storage of carbon through soils. So obviously there's been a lot of interest lately in the contribution that soil carbon can make to meeting Australia's emissions reductions targets, and also the contribution that it makes to improving agricultural productivity. There are also a number of methods that allow people to earn carbon credits by changing the way that they manage their livestock effluent. And this is primarily through what we call anaerobic digesters, which allow the waste to be managed in a way where the methane is converted to carbon dioxide, which reduces the impact on the atmosphere. And it also allows the generation of heat, which is particularly useful in some of the sectors such as dairy. The fourth land sector category is savanna burning. So as I said, there's a lot of projects in Northern Australia which can earn carbon credits by changing the way in which fire is managed. So primarily what they're trying to do there is reduce these really hot late season burns by strategically managing the fire so that you have fires occurring in the early dry season, which reduces the amount of emissions associated with fire in the north. I should say that all of these methods are associated with a range of benefits other than just reducing carbon. So many of them are associated with improved productivity, improved environmental outcomes, and of course they are an additional revenue source which allows people to diversify their operations. One of the questions that we often get asked are, why are there so many rules? Why is this so complex? And primarily it comes down to the fact that what we're trying to do here is create a unit with integrity that represents an additional and genuine unit of carbon abatement. That's really important, not only because it contributes to our international targets, but it's also important because the market is demanding units that represent robust and additional abatement. Under the Emissions Reduction Fund, we have what are called offsets integrity standards, and they are championed by the Independent Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee that basically assesses the methods to ensure that they are contributing additional abatement and that there is evidence to underpin the science behind the development of the method. The other thing that I should mention is that for the sequestration activities such as storing carbon in vegetation or soils, there is what we call a permanence requirement, and that means that the carbon needs to be protected for either 25 or 100 years. So initially when the scheme was set up, it was a 100-year permanence requirement, but in response to, I guess, calls for increased flexibility, a 25-year permanence period was introduced that is associated with a discount to the amount of carbon credits that you're issued. But it does allow people to sort of have that flexibility about how they might want to manage their land in the longer term. The Clean Energy Regulator is, so that's who I work for, and it's the government agency that's responsible for administering the program alongside the department's role as Beth outlined. So we have 4 main roles. The first is that we help people to understand their obligations under the scheme, and we help them to register projects. We also issue the Australian carbon credit units after we assess their applications against the method requirements. So we check, have they done what they've said that they would do? We check things like, are the trees continuing to grow? The third thing that we do is that we purchase ACCUs. As I said, we do account for more than about 95% of purchases at the moment, but we are expecting this to shift over time as the private sector and other state governments become more interested in reducing emissions and doing that through Australian carbon credit units. We tend to hold 2 auctions a year. We held our last one in April, and the average price there was about $16 a tonne. And as Beth said, we have just been the proud recipient of a new role, which is to develop new methods under the Emissions Reduction Fund. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next set of slides. This year's development priorities are a new soil carbon method, a plantation forestry method, a blue carbon method, biomethane and carbon capture and storage. We're doing this through a co-design process, and we have a KPI to develop these methods by the end of the year. So we're quite excited by this because it is a real opportunity to bring forward new methods that address some of the barriers that we know exist in the Emissions Reduction Fund and enable people to participate in new opportunities to reduce abatement. So look, I was going to go quickly through the methods. I'll try and do that in the remaining 2 minutes. Soil carbon, so this is about changing the way that you manage your land to sequester carbon. The new thing about this method is that we're trying to address we're trying to make it easier for people to have a good cash flow through these carbon credits by using not only sampling, so soil sampling, but also using a hybrid models approach. In plantations, we're building off the existing method and also allowing opportunities for people to earn carbon credit units in a situation where they can demonstrate that they would otherwise have cleared the plantation forest. So that's a new activity. Blue carbon, this is a really exciting one. It's got some great co-benefits. It will allow people to earn Australian carbon credits for sequestering carbon in the mangroves and seagrasses, as well as the emissions that are avoided when the soil is flooded, and also carbon stored in soil. It's very exciting. There's lots of interest in that space. Biomethane, this is allowing people to earn units for injecting biomethane into the gas network, first time in Australia. And there are opportunities there for agricultural waste. Last thing I wanted to say is that we are trying to make participation in the ERF easier. So there was a lot of things that came out of the King Review report, which identified opportunities for us to make it easier for people to participate and access the additional revenue opportunities from ACCUs. This includes things such as changing the way that we contract so that we can underpin investment in abatement by allowing people to have a guaranteed purchaser in the Australian government, but also allow them to seek a higher price if they can get it, and that's okay. But what we've done is we've sort of underpinned the market there. There's also some things we're doing around allowing people to contract with us and receive upfront payments for soil measurement. We're trying to halve the time in which we do our registration and issuance of ACCUs through things such as RegTech, making it easier for people to use the forms. And we've also got an exciting piece of work out of Michelle Crosby's branch around making it easier for smaller players to participate in the ERF through making it easier to register and also receive your units, as well as some work that we're doing to reduce the audit burden. So I know that I raced through that, so happy to answer questions after everyone else is finished. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much for that presentation, Mel. That was awesome. So next up, we've got Kerrin. Brad's the General Manager for the Carbon Market Institute. So as lots of you know, NRM Regions Australia is a member of the Carbon Markets Institute, and they're doing lots of really interesting work in this space. They've really got their finger on the pulse with what's happening in the carbon market. So I'm going to hand over to Brad to give an overview of some of the emerging trends and opportunities that they're noting that will be of relevance to our regional organisations, and also to have a bit of a chat about the voluntary code of conduct that they're working through with project developers. So thanks very much, Brad.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you all. I see some familiar faces. What I wanted to talk to you all about, I guess, as Rachel has said, is give a bit of a step back a bit and give you a bit of a high level overview of what we're seeing out in the world, that sort of global context, the Australian context, then bring it down to a market, policy, corporate driver level to sort of give you an understanding of how things are shifting and why they're shifting, and then what that means potentially for different NRM groups and the ways that you engage in that space. So I guess to start, despite COVID coming into play early last year, the global momentum on climate change hasn't stopped. In fact, it's the ambition of the global community has increased, and it's moving fairly rapidly. What we've seen is that there's a strong voice of institutional investors, so banks and superannuation funds and others, as well as communities, state governments, and other interest groups, that's really building, and it's supported by governments, more ambitious governments around the world that have been increasing their own ambition. And we've seen the US re-enter the Paris Agreement following the Biden election, and that means that their presence once again in a global leadership role has pushed and is continuing to push other governments and other regional players to invest in a stronger way and increase their own ambition globally. And so what we've seen over the last particularly 6 to 8 months is that all of Australia's top 10 two-way trading partners have all put into place or announced a net zero target. Majority of those are by 2050, China has by 2060, and there are a few others that are by 2040. But what that means is that there's increasing pressure for Australia to increase its own ambition politically, to take a stronger policy and market position, transition away from fossil fuels, take a net zero, set a net zero target, and a longer term strategy that aligns with where the rest of the world is going, or aligns with the Paris Agreement. And what we're seeing is that net zero by 2050 is now a given baseline, and we're seeing countries and even companies now saying, well, 2050 is that benchmark and that goal, but we need to be talking about where we're going to be in 2030. How do we get to 2030? How do we get to 2040 so that we're not leaving this work to that last 10 years? So there's that pressure that's growing, and from Australia politically, there's developments in small and step change technologies as the focus, but that improved leadership on stronger climate ambition really remains to be seen. And we're awaiting a long-term strategy announcement from the government, hopefully before UN climate negotiations that are due to take place in Glasgow in November this year, COP26. The Conference of Parties. So there's whispers around that this might include a net zero target, but that really remains to be seen, and trying to understand how we take things like the recommendations of the King Review, which are being implemented at the moment, the technology roadmap that the government has put in place, and the updated statements, and try to understand how that roadmap reaches a destination. And that's what we're missing at the destination. We are heading into an election cycle soon, so we can expect more political overtures, I suppose, from the various parties on climate policy in the coming months. Unfortunately, the climate politics, just to touch on that, is still very alive and well in Australia. We've got far-right elements that we've seen in the last couple of weeks from the coalition still lobbying for coal-fired power generation assets, and then others criticising the efficacy and integrity of carbon farming activities in different parts of the country. And yet we still have Labor in the dark on their own policies. So that will be interesting to see how these different struggles within parties and between parties emerges. At a practical level, we're seeing really strong, purposeful and meaningful activities undertaken by the government, by the Clean Energy Regulator and the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, and even the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, particularly more as they start to navigate the increasingly complex web of climate-related aid, trade and diplomatic relationships. across the world. We're seeing stronger catalytic support through these developments and these departmental and regulator operations, particularly around things like land, looking at options for how we might stack and enable multiple activities on one piece of land, sort of a whole of landscape approach. Looking at a more holistic approach to data gathering and data management over time, looking at how we improve scheme dynamics to enable lower administrative and cost burdens to dissipate. And that really goes to the implementation of the King Review recommendations and to what's already been spoken about with the Clean Energy Regulator taking on a stronger role in the implementation of those recommendations, taking some of those responsibilities from DISA and other responsibilities going to DISA. We're also seeing a reprioritisation around new method development, and what we'll see in the coming months is a more collaborative approach with industry to some of those items that I've just mentioned, but also looking at how you engage industry in looking at development of new methods, how you improve existing methods, trying to look at the suite of methodologies, ACCU-generating methodologies that are there, and looking at how we expand that and create other opportunities to generate abatement across the landscape. And I'm focusing on the landscape piece because the industrial emissions reductions, when you're talking about energy generation and manufacturing facilities, needs a fairly different approach, and is potentially of less interest to this group, but can touch on that later in questions. We're also seeing the first forays by the government, and this is quite a strong policy shift into regional carbon market activities. So a couple of weeks ago, Minister Taylor and Minister Ley announced a $59.9 million fund to support the development of new Paris-compliant pilot activities in the Indo-Pacific region that fit under future Paris Agreement rules that will require higher integrity, transparency, and accountability. So looking at the opportunity to take the knowledge and expertise that we have in business and government in Australia and take that out into the Asia Pacific region to develop up activities that could then create a flow of credits that come back into Australia. So part of that is early learning. What have we got in Australia that we can take out to the region and show broader leadership? And that comes to project development, finance, community engagement. There's a lot of different parts around that. So in that context, we're seeing business at home and abroad moving ahead of government policy. What we saw with COVID was really interesting in that it led to a 2020 focus on managing risk and behavioural change and innovation in an immediate term context of an existential crisis. But going through that process for a lot of large companies that suddenly had to stop, drop and roll, it's probably not the best way of using that phrase, but they learned how to do that. They learned that they could shift, and then they've been able to apply that thinking to climate change, which is still an existential crisis, but just the response is in a longer time frame. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot more focus on the development and announcement of net zero strategies from a lot of large corporates. There's more ownership at an executive and a board level, and there's starting to be better understanding of the climate implications for businesses across different business functions rather than just the sustainability person. And so what that means is that there's more people engaged in this, and businesses are now looking at how do they collaborate across different industry sectors and functions within a business, because with COVID, they couldn't tackle that alone. So how do you apply that to climate change? You can't tackle that alone. So the need and value of partnerships is increasing. So the strategy piece has been done by a lot of those companies that kind of didn't have that much ambition, but they've now stepped that up. And so companies are now, from the beginning of 2020, are looking to implement strategy, build partnerships, invest in talent, in education and solutions. And so there's a real big opportunity now to connect with business, with finance, with industry on how you develop the solutions that can support the transitions of these large companies. So down to the last minute, and I'll touch on just a couple of other things. That has led to some pretty big changes in the market dynamics, the carbon market dynamics around trading and procurement of carbon. And there's an increased readiness to actively engage in the carbon market, to test procurement strategies, to understand the financing, legal, budgeting implications, to build partnerships, to acquire project development capabilities, and invest in longer term carbon supply chains. So seeing spot market prices settling significantly above what the government's paying through the Emissions Reduction Fund auctions, around the $18.40 a tonne mark, but we've reached records earlier this year around $18.50 per tonne. For the longer term offtake agreements, sort of the 3, 4, 5-year agreements that large companies are starting to engage directly with project developers on, they're looking at prices above $20 in the early mid-20s for delivery of carbon units in 2023, 2025. That's not financial advice. Please don't take it as such. That's more anecdotal, just what we're hearing about some of those changes. So that there's a lot of interest as well in those other interlinked challenges. So you're thinking about the measurement and valuation of co-benefits, trying to overcome the limited carbon knowledge that banks, legal and property valuation advisors have in regional and rural areas, and that prevents scaled investment in land sector carbon activities, particularly if you've got a farmer going to a bank with a project developer saying, I want to do this, and the bank goes, I don't know what this contract is, carbon farming, that's not a thing, I don't want to do it. So there's starting to be a lot more work focused on how you develop financial literacy in a lot of those regional and rural institutions, as well as being able to connect land sector buyers and sellers in one place to have that conversation. And what that builds is the need for integrity, transparency, and accountability, so that people on the ground have enough information to make informed decisions of whether or not to get in bed with a project developer. And that's where the Carbon Industry Code of Conduct comes in as a consumer protection watchdog that we're building up for full operation on the 1st of July, that will be able to take complaints if there are dodgy operators out there that aren't supporting landholders or trying to dodge them a little bit. So there's so much more going on, but that's just trying to give you a bit of an overview. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention our upcoming Australasian Emissions Reduction Summit. This is the sales pitch on the 24th and 25th of June in Sydney, and virtually as well. I'll put some links in the chat. That's really the Australian community, anyone to do with carbon markets, farming, finance, investment, government policy, coming together to really understand where the market is now and where the opportunities are. So I invite you all to join. NRM Regions Australia is a member, so you will all be able to register at member rates. Hopefully I see you there, and I'll leave the rest to questions.
Thanks so much, Brad. That was an excellent, very dense whip through of the current outlook. But I actually, I thought it was really great to get your view on what's going on. It was really nice to hear that there's a bit of a optimistic outlook in some sense for an increase in abatement, and also a lot of potential for increasing international collaboration, and also a higher price per tonne of carbon. So those things that are all obviously going to have impacts on people working in the carbon farming space. So yeah, thanks very much for that. And I'm sure people might have to reflect on your presentation for a minute before they think about what questions they want to put in. But just a reminder to feel free to pop them in, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end. So the final speaker that we've got for this session this morning is Don Butler. So Don's an ecologist and biogeographer. He's worked extensively in the development of Australia's carbon farming initiatives, and with a particular focus also on projects that have a biodiversity element. So Don's going to give us an overview of his work and the current developments in the co-benefit space, which I know Brad also touched on very briefly, so it's a good segue. And John's going to include a bit of an overview of the National Carbon Plus Biodiversity pilot project that's been delivered through ANU. So thanks very much for joining us today, Don.
Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. I'll add my acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land I'm on, the Jagera and Turrbal people. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm here to talk about co-benefits, was the brief I was given, take a fairly high level view, and then hopefully, if I've got enough time, burrow into a little bit of detail. I've cheekily kind of titled this talk Co-Benefits, the Main Game. I should dismiss that instantly as a thought bubble, really. Like, it can't be the main game. It's a carbon market we're talking about, and the integrity of the carbon credit unit is central. I've raised the question mostly because as long as there have been carbon markets, there have been people who bring their own perspectives to the opportunity that market represents, and asking the question, how can we advance other causes, like my interest in biodiversity and environmental management, which I'm sure is shared by many on this call, through the opportunity that carbon markets present us with. And that's really the space that co-benefits occupies. I've clipped a couple of titles from papers. There's one here from 2000 talking about how the clean development mechanism might support good for the world. And one that's been particularly important for my journey is this carbon accumulation through ecosystem recovery, which was another example of ecologists talking about how what we know can help the carbon market achieve outcomes that sit beside the climate mitigation services that are being paid for through the carbon market. Probably the best poster child for co-benefits is the Savannah burning industry in Northern Australia. And if any of you have been to the Savannah Fire Forum, which is held annually up north, you'll hopefully agree with me. If any of you haven't been, I encourage you to try to get there. It's a great illustration of the things that an industry can do for communities. People up there talk about co-benefits as the thing that motivates them to be engaged in the industry that they're in. Obviously, there's recognition that the greenhouse gas abatement must be real and have integrity, but it's a real showcase of the power of co-benefits to motivate participation, as well as to yield an industry that's got a lot of strength to it. So I'd encourage you to go along. My interest, as Rachel said, is primarily in the biodiversity component, and there have been quite a bit of academic work done on how to kind of distort or manage carbon opportunities in ways that can promote good outcomes for biodiversity through carbon abatement. The key thing that comes out of that work is really the recognition that if you, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, of course, if you focus solely on the carbon or greenhouse gas abatement opportunity, you won't get much else. But if with a few little tweaks, especially at the early stage in planning and thinking about where you're going to invest, you deliberately consider other outcomes, co-benefits, then you can ensure you get a much broader range of benefit for the same investment with very little cost to the amount of carbon you're able to sequester or avoid emission of. And that really colours the whole kind of development of co-benefit thinking in some of the programs that I've been involved with, like the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland, and I see other states are doing similar things, and also the Carbon Plus Biodiversity program that we're working with the Commonwealth Government on. It's to kind of deliberately choose the projects to invest in based on the other things they deliver with the carbon. So that's the kind of co-benefit concept, to ensure that you get maximum value for your money, really. Of course, all of this market can only work so long as there's integrity in both the carbon unit and, by extension, the co-benefits that we're buying. So we need to understand that integrity and the integrity principles for offsets that were articulated for carbon offsets, they apply also for environmental offsets, and they matter just as much for co-benefits. So I've cooked them down to two here, but you'll see there's a lot of dot points under the second one. Essentially, you can't be paying for things that would have happened anyway, unless you want to lose the opportunity to spend that money on something else. So anything that would have occurred in the ordinary course of events, that's not good for carbon, it's not good for biodiversity or other co-benefits either, in terms of investment. And also that the estimation of what good you've bought should be solid. So we don't want to overestimate, we want to see measurement, we want things to be verifiable. And when I say we, this is something that we also hear from the big institutional investors and other investors from state governments and others. Brad was mentioning have a growing interest in Australia's carbon market, but they're looking for these sorts of signs of integrity in the projects that they're looking to invest in. Of course, this year, and it's particularly evident that there's a fair bit of blowback on some of the stuff that's been done in the past that kind of raises questions about the integrity of some of the carbon projects that have happened globally, as well as some of the other impacts that come with carbon projects in Australia. So there's been a long kind of voice of criticism about some of the changes that we're seeing in land management in some parts of the country, like southwest Queensland. And co-benefits in some ways are also an opportunity to kind of lay out the net outcome for society, for biodiversity, for the environment more broadly, that come with a carbon project. So good verification and measurement of the full range of outcomes that are kicked off by a carbon project can help address some of these questions about whether they're good projects to invest in. And I've included this table here, which is a breakdown from a European think tank on the types of offset projects that are low risk versus high risk. And this is just in terms of additionality. And a lot of the work that we're interested in the NRM space falls into what you might call a higher risk project type. And that's just a recognition that it's not always easy to tell whether or not something might have happened in the normal course of events without your investment. So it kind of reiterates the importance of verification and conservative estimates and really clear-headed consideration of additionality when you're talking about co-benefits and carbon and these sorts of method spaces. So this rather ugly graph with lots of, and this is just an old example of a carbon abatement cost curve. So we have all the things that you might do to abate carbon arrayed along the x-axis in the order of their costs. So the cheap things that should really organise themselves and therefore are unlikely to be strongly additional are down here below the line, where they cost less to do than they make you. And then the other options are arrayed with increasing cost along that curve. And the point of this slide is really that hidden beneath these curves, which kind of compartmentalize costs, is a full array of costs based on land restoration activities. So for example, they've got afforestation here in 3 different places. You can imagine some really expensive rainforest restoration projects in the wet tropics, for example, at the top end, versus some of what we've seen under regeneration projects, where you're just changing the management of feral animals, for example, down the lower end. And the point I'm trying to make with this slide really is that things like the LRF program in Queensland, the Land Restoration Fund, which is focused on co-benefits, to my mind, what we were doing there was looking to enable projects that delivered a lot of co-benefits by selecting them from further up the cost curve than the current ERF price enables them to sort of kick off at. So you can choose which projects to invest in first based on the co-benefits that they bring. I'm going to just skip through these because I talked too much at the start. The key thing I want to point out at the bottom of that list of dot points there is that one of the considerations when you're thinking about buying additional benefits is who the good goes to. So whether you're paying for something that's a private good or something that's a public good is a really important consideration for someone investing public money, for example, from a state government. So a little bit more about the specifics of the LRF. This is a Queensland government scheme that I worked on. It's still going. Hopefully we'll be announcing a second round. I'm looking forward to seeing. So to ensure that we were looking to pay for additional co-benefits, for example, the first round of this fund was designed to only invest in new projects. So that's a simple additionality mechanism. We paid for carbon credits in a bundle with the co-benefits, so effectively just paid a higher price for carbon credits. And we set out clear rules around co-benefit verification and reporting that ensured transparency through what will eventually be a public register of co-benefits, through our co-benefit standard, which linked to a priority investment plan, which identified the state's public good that they wanted to be buying from carbon projects. So that sort of addresses some of those issues I've raised around integrity for co-benefits. We also took a step towards transparency and measurement rigor for environmental co-benefits by offering proponents the opportunity to use third-party assurance by developing environmental accounts for their projects to document changes in the assets like vegetation or wetlands that they were managing to show that they'd improved in condition and therefore verify their co-benefits in a really rigorous way. That brings costs, of course, and that's part of the experiment that the LRF is, really seeing how the market, when that fund goes to on-sell the carbon credits they bought, responds to that opportunity to buy credits with high verification. So these are these maps show a quick kind of snapshot of the outcomes. The map on the left shows where there were ERF projects with contracts in Queensland using vegetation methods. You can see there's a concentration in southwest Queensland, and the map on the right is those projects that were invested in by the LRF. So you can see there's a fair distinction in their geographical spread. So we weren't just paying for the same kind of carbon project that you might have seen without investment in co-benefits. And you can also see through those maps at the bottom, I hope, that they do align with state priorities for public good, like reef catchments and endangered ecosystems. That slide's too busy. I'll skip over it in the interest of time. Essentially just saying that we're leveraging environmental accounting as a tool to quantify environmental change in the interest of bringing co-benefits to fruition, really, as opportunities in their own right to stand alone beside carbon, either stacked, where the projects involve the same space, or potentially side by side, where you'll do an environmental project for its own sake under something like a reef credit scheme. So these are the main points I wanted to make. Integrity is really central to co-benefits, just as it is to carbon, but co-benefits can help proponents to sort of explain why their project has integrity in terms of the other impacts that it has on culture and environment. You can, by electing to pay more for carbon credits from projects that bring co-benefits, sort of select projects from up that cost curve I showed you a figure of, to bring them to market now rather than waiting for the carbon price to get to the point where they're viable. And we do hope to see, well, I personally certainly do, and I know many others working in this space hope to see co-benefits move fairly rapidly from being add-ons to being explicitly quantified opportunities in themselves. And the final point there is that if you are expecting to be paid more or looking to pay more for carbon projects because of their co-benefits, it's very reasonable to expect that project to do something extra, not look like a vanilla carbon project. Otherwise, you may be wasting your money. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much for that overview, Donna. It's really great to see, and I know a lot of what you're saying has been reiterated by a lot of people in the NRM regional organisations networks in terms of the move from co-benefits to core benefits, and hopefully this keeps happening. It seems like there's a bit of market interest in paying a bit more for these more premium products that deliver a lot of value. So yeah, it's really great to get that overview from you. We're going to move to questions now. So if you just bear with me for a second. The first question that we've got is from Kerrin Thomas, and it was a question that was to Mel, and it was, can we hear more about the blue carbon method, and does the blue carbon method include teal carbon too? So I'm very interested in hearing about this teal carbon. Mel, if you've got an answer to that one.
Sure. So the blue carbon method is primarily focused on tidal ecosystems. So that's the reintroduction of tidal flows through the removal of things like seawalls or changing the way that cane drains operate. So the focus is primarily on those sort of tidal ecosystems as opposed to sort of the teal or freshwater ecosystems. I mean, part of the reason is that some of the science that's underpinning the blue carbon method is actually new. So we're working quite collaboratively with a number of blue carbon scientists to develop new carbon abatement models to underpin the method. So there is a lot of work being done in that space at the moment. So that's why, and that's part of the reason why I guess the focus is sort of on those coastal ecosystems.
The next question that I've got, actually it's from Kate at NRM Regions Australia, and I'll give Kate a question since she's the boss. What do you, and this is to Don, what do you see as the potential role of regional NRM plans and planning in supporting co-benefits in carbon farming?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We certainly used spatial representations of where priorities lie for NRM regions, for state governments, for others, around kind of opportunities to deliver public good through environmental restoration, vegetation restoration, for example, that certainly supports the opportunity for projects delivering those types of activities in those places to then say, well, look, the NRM plan said it's a good idea here, we're doing it, therefore there's a co-benefit. Like, it just creates the narrative easily for people. Likewise, if there are places in a region that, you know, for whatever reason, it may be bad to see more trees. So, for example, some that I'm aware of might be rivers that are already affected by high salinity loads. You don't want to see reduced runoff into those rivers. You know, you can kind of direct industry, and also people looking at industry wondering whether this is a good project or a bad project. The more information that's out there to help people do that kind of due diligence on projects, the better, from my point of view. So NRM plans, they've got a, you know, that pivotal role that was written in the first CFI Act. It's still there. They're a great opportunity for transparent communication of priorities at that regional scale.
Thanks, Don. So the next question that I've got on for Mel. So Mel, could you please expand a bit more on the differences in the new soil carbon method compared to the current soil carbon method?
So I might just provide a little bit of background on the existing method for people that might not be that familiar with it. So the existing method is based on the measurement of soil carbon. So you need to get a baseline understanding of what your carbon concentration is before you undertake the project. And then every 1 year to 5 years, you sample using soil sample cores generally, or spectroscopy, to get an understanding of how the activities that you've done have increased your soil carbon. And those activities might be things like applying nutrients, seeding pastures, or changing the tilling practices on your land. So the new method has two key components. So the first is that it's providing enhancements to the existing measured only model. So in the existing methods, the calculations contain an error, which we're fixing in this new method to enable people to be able to calculate abatement under the method. And we're also looking at whether or not there's opportunities to increase flexibility while maintaining integrity. For example, we are looking at whether or not this new method might be able to allow soil carbon activities to be undertaken in what we call forest land, which was previously excluded. And the important thing to note there is that you will need to be able to demonstrate that you're undertaking the soil management activities on that new land. I guess the main thing that's different though between this method and the old method is that the new method allows a hybrid approach. So what this effectively will enable people to be able to do is to have carbon credits issued on the basis of a model rather than on the basis of measurement, in order to sort of reduce the costs that are associated with measurement over time and allow people to access greater cash flow. The important thing though to understand about that one is that the models will need to be demonstrated that they are appropriately calibrated and validate for the regions in which they're being used. So we are developing a set of principles that people can use to sort of demonstrate that the models that they're using to estimate carbon appropriately validate. And we're working with some CSIRO scientists to make sure that that framework is robust. So that's probably the key differences there.
Thanks very much for that overview, Mel. That was really useful. I've got a question for Beth. Can you explain the role that NRM regional organisations can play in prioritising method development? So how can we be involved?
Yeah, so I think on the method prioritisation, I think some of you are already aware that we had anticipated communicating a process for the carbon industry generally, which includes participants and NRM organisations to engage with method prioritisation, and that we really expected that, communicating that sometime over the past couple of months. The timing of that sits with the minister, so I can't advise on that. We are still anticipating that happening sometime soon. In terms of NRM organisation engagement with that, I think their understanding of what's happening with their farming communities can enable them to understand where some of the gaps in the carbon methods are, and where the land managers and farming community sees that there are opportunities that aren't being picked up through the current methods, then that identification of that flow through of information to us can help in the process of identifying where new methods could be targeted. The other side is the supporting that process is that the data and information that sits underneath methods. And again, I think detailed data flow is a complex process, but NRM organisations have that direct connection to land managers and their communities, where some of that data and information on activities and outcomes from activities sit, and that can flow through to the method prioritisation process as well. In practical terms, I think that this might be linked to a comment that came through, or a permutation on the comment that came through, is the practical process of providing input. That there will be a formal process for that, and for that's what will, the Minister will determine at the precise time of when that occurs. We would anticipate that happening well before the end of the year. NRM organisations and NRM Regions Australia would certainly be welcome to contribute to that process, but the contract that we have with NRM Regions Australia also incorporates a component of seeking and providing that process, that input to us, so they can also feed it through NRM Regions Australia.
Just to add to what Beth was saying, if I could, CMI as a, I think it's around 75% of the contracted abatement in Australia sits within CMI member hands in terms of developers of land and industrial type activities. So we'll be having a fairly strong position or hopefully input into that prioritisation process. We're certainly in discussions with the Minister and his office, with the regulator and the department, around understanding the timing of that prioritisation process, so that when that happens, that we'll be able to take our industry input, and they'll all make their own representations, of course, but to consolidate some of that feedback and input that at a certain level of quality with right details in that. And some of that's around new methods, but the development of new methods particularly can take several years. The Savannah burning method, I think, took 10 years to get off the ground. So looking at new activities, there's certainly a lot of time and effort that needs to go into that. Well, the other part of this is looking at existing methods and where you can create new opportunities. Maybe there's a small language change in the legislation that could be developed, or something else that enables that method to create more abatement opportunities. One of those is looking at a landscape method approach, which we have a landscape task force that's working on some of those data management issues that are there at the moment, on how you not just measure canopy changes, but what are the carbon pools that exist underneath the canopy that you could look at to start measuring, to quantify other sort of carbon sequestration or reductions that are happening. So what are the ways that we can enhance existing methodologies, perhaps stack them, is another thought that's starting to be developed. How do you take different methods and apply them to one farm? Or if that's not possible, how do you ensure that activities can be complementary to each other, rather than preventing, if you do one method here, that you can't do another one next to it, or there's some of those questions. How do we use what we've got, enhance it, whilst we're taking the time to build new methods?
Yeah, and good point, Brad. That method prioritisation process isn't just about new methods. There are enhancements or variations to methods that can come through that, and they're about providing that method development or variation enhancement work program for the regulator to work through over the following year. So because of that connection, I don't know if Mel wanted to add any comments as well.
As Beth and Brad said, there is a process to prioritise methods. We, work closely with the department, Brad and others, to sort of understand where the opportunities might be. And I guess the great challenge for everyone working in this space is that there is a lot going on. And I think in terms of understanding where to put resources. There's a lot of work in prioritising methods, because you want to prioritise a method that's kind of got the science to back it up, that's got material abatement associated with it, and has got, I guess, industry from both buyers and sellers. So I guess what I'm saying is that we're all sort of keen to work together to understand where those efforts should be placed. And we've got a very full dance card at the moment this year in terms of the work we're doing around the new methods and as Beth said, some of the sort of method variation work that we're doing as well.
Thanks very much for rounding that out, Mel. It's great to have that conversation about where the method development's up to. I've just got a question now for Brad. So there are some mixed voluntary markets in the ARF operating in Australia. Do they operate to the same level of authentication, and are there risks to the legitimacy of markets operating with different levels of rigour? What are the risks for farmers and land managers who enter the markets?
Thanks. Yes, this is a fun one. I didn't really think I had time to touch on it in my other comments, but it's something that's emerging that is really interesting to see. So the voluntary market is growing really rapidly, and it's evolving quite quickly. One of the things that we're trying to understand at the moment is how the rules around the Paris Agreement, those global market trading rules that are developing under what they're calling Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, how those rules will impact trading on the ground, whether that's between companies within one country in that sort of domestic market, or whether it's between companies that are trading across two different countries. So whether you need to, how you avoid counting emissions reductions in one place, selling them to another, and counting them there, and effectively double counting emissions reductions. It goes to the integrity of the market, and it's certainly an issue there about how you manage emissions reductions in one place and don't double up in another place. So that's one of the issues that we're facing with voluntary markets, is if countries start to develop their own schemes, like we have ACCU generating schemes, and start to say, well, I want to take control of the abatement in my country or my region, then what does that enable companies or other people to do and have control over on their own property and other things? So there's a lot of unanswered questions that I think we're just waiting to see what happens with global rules. But what we're seeing on the ground is that for a long time, ACCU generation in Australia has been the only game, because the government, through the Emissions Reduction Fund and previous iterations under the Carbon Farming Initiative Act, have been the primary purchaser of abatement in Australia. Now we're moving to the private sector starting to come in and become a much bigger purchaser, in the next 5 to 10 years, having some of those longer term offtake agreements and contracts with developers. So that's starting to shift from government to industry. And for what industry is looking at definitely is the co-benefits piece, but also how do we get this stuff going really quickly? There are other methodologies internationally that do activities that you can't do yet in Australia. So can we do those activities in Australia? Could we take a gold standard method or a BCS method and just do the activity in Australia? And I've had probably 8 to 10 of those questions from different organisations in the last month. There's a lot of interest in that. But at the moment in Australia, it's not possible. And this is where it gets tricky, because particularly in the land sector, all of the abatement is automatically captured in our national inventory, in our national accounts, that gets reported to the United Nations, the UNFCCC. Where there's a difficulty is understanding the measurement of carbon below the ground. So the soil carbon, I guess, isn't automatically captured, because that isn't part of what we are required to report to the UNFCCC, and we don't have necessarily that whole of landscape approach to that just yet. What that means is that there's this tricky boundary where technically someone could come in, create their own standard, do something on the ground, and own that abatement and sell it somewhere else. But what we see with some of those activities or operations that kind of pop up and get tested, and we've seen Microsoft purchase some abatement in that way with someone that's developed up their own standard, is that the integrity isn't there, and there's questions around the quality of the abatement that's being generated, and whether or not that might be rescinded at a later date, or whether it might be captured in a different way by someone else. So I think as some of these other micro standards emerge, where there isn't really an understanding of the quality, there isn't really a control over that quality in the same way that there is for ACCU generation, which is really world-class, high standard measurement, reporting, verification standard, comparable to, if not higher quality than gold standard and Verra, some of those international standards. What I think we need to be very careful of is a market that enables other things to flourish where there isn't a similar level of control or quality. I think that's what we're seeing now, is we don't have any of those other systems in place that automatically capture some of these new activities that are emerging. The question for me is, we've got some of these things like Regen Network created a soil carbon, regenerative agriculture soil carbon standard. There are some questions around the integrity of that that have come through to me. So what happens if other types of activities that aren't automatically captured by Australian methodologies, or what we report to the United Nations, to the UNFCCC, what if other things come up in future that we're not aware of? How do we manage the integrity of those things that we don't have control of, like we do with our domestic standards? So that's something I'm trying to grapple with at the moment. It's that broader question of the integrity of the whole market, including those voluntary players that are popping up on the sidelines of this development that's happening. How do we make sure that doesn't negatively impact people on the ground?
Thanks so much for your very comprehensive answer to that question. It looks like it's an extremely complex field at the moment, and changing rapidly. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space on the question around the voluntary market there, Brad. So yeah, thanks very much for that overview. I've got a question that's been asked to everybody. So how do you see the relationship between ERF opportunities and goals requirements by various industries to become carbon neutral playing out for farmers? So we might even just go to Don, because we haven't heard from Don for a while. So Don, did you have anything that you want to address to that question?
Well, it's a good one. And it's a complicated space again. The tricky thing, as Brad alluded to, is making sure that something's not counted twice. So for farms, for example, to make themselves carbon neutral, it becomes tricky for them to then sell ACCUs that they generate through carbon abatement projects. So that question about am I best starting a project and keeping all of the ACCUs, or selling them and then buying some cheaper ones from somewhere else? Like, it gets very complicated quite quickly, and we're yet to really see some of those issues resolved, because I think there are some industries that seem to be looking at the opportunity as a way to get the rest of society to pay for that industry becoming carbon neutral, and I can't see how that washes in the long term. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, I think that's the main question there that Don mentioned. It's for farmers and landholders, what's the driver behind engaging and getting involved in these activities? Is it to become a carbon neutral producer yourself? And that we've seen some instances, particularly with the government's climate active standard, of carbon neutral beef and carbon neutral wine. And the stories from that are that they're offsetting some of their emissions through a project, but they're also purchasing units. And the focus there is not on creating units to sell to a private market. It's about creating a carbon neutral product that you can sell to the market and using that for your branding and reputation. That's a very different perspective to, I want to generate credits to sell to a market and diversify my revenue streams. So I think it's really what this comes down to is trying to understand what the driver is for the landholder. Is it mitigation versus adaptation? Are you doing these activities to look at different ways of revegetating or managing the health of your soil and the resilience of your property? Maybe there's different drivers there. I think that's probably the first question to understand, and it's going to be different for every landholder depending on their business and what they do.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Red. I can just see Mel was, do you want to jump in just on that landholder comment there, Mel?
Oh, yeah, look, I was just going to say, I agree with the comments by Brad and Don. I think it's really important to understand that the owner of the ACCU holds the property right to those emissions reductions, and you can really only use that once. So if you've sold it to someone else and they've used it to offset their own emissions, then that offset has been used. It can't be used twice. So as Brad said, I think it's really important to understand what is the motivation of the landholder. And there is that distinction between providing offsets for someone else to use and providing an offset for you to use when you claim carbon neutrality, because the offset can only be used once.
There's also a really low level of education around this. I get calls from state governments that are trying to develop their own carbon farming industry plans, and that issue around double counting isn't well understood. And then you go out actually on the ground to people who are wanting to do this, and they don't understand the complexities. So there's definitely a need, there's a gap there, and state governments are engaging in this at varying levels, as well as the federal government. But I think there's definitely a role for NRMs, depending on your region and your own business models, on providing information and education to landholders so that they are informed enough to make a decision to self-select to engage in this process, and not just to say, yes, I'm going to generate credits, but how is this going to benefit my business? How is this going to help me, hand my farm over to my kids one day, or to have a higher quality product that I can sell to market? I think it really has to come back to the first principles. But to make those decisions, you need to understand what those pathways to market are for all those different things, and I think that's where there's a gap.
Thanks very much, everyone, for that sort of comprehensive answer to that question. I've probably got enough room for one or maybe two more questions to answer. I've got one that I think should be pretty straightforward, which is to Mel. Will you open another call for new method development soon, especially if you're aiming to have these new methods developed by the end of this year? And then the question is also, when will the 4 new ERF methods be available to use? So I think that those ones are related.
Yeah, so I might answer the second question first. So we're aiming to have a finalised soil carbon method by September of this year, and a finalised biomethane implantations method before the end of the year. I might hand over to Beth actually to talk about the method prioritisation process.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. So that was really the question I'd half registered and tried to answer earlier. And that's, yes, we're aware that a lot of people had already anticipated the method prioritisation process. So the way by which we develop the list of priority methods that then forms the work program for the regulator over the following year. That list of method priorities is made by the minister, decided by the minister. We advise him in that process. We had already anticipated having a process out and communicated already for the carbon industry to engage with and put forward their proposals and ideas for that. But the timing of that is with the minister, and not something that I can advise on. It should happen by the end of the year, obviously, to form a forward work program for the regulator. It's really up to the minister to determine precisely when that happens.
I just had one question left that I wanted to go to, just because it's a bit unusual and I'm not actually sure who will be able to answer this one, but this is the final question, and it's, is there scope to include the latest blockchain and satellite technology into measuring carbon? And I'll ask whoever's going to take up the gauntlet to keep their answer quite brief, because we've just got a couple of minutes till we have to close. So thank you.
Look, I can have a crack. So there is some pretty exciting stuff going on in terms of using satellites and other technology to understand the relationship between things like pasture and soil carbon. So our expectation is that people will use that kind of technology to inform the development of models that are being used in the soil carbon space, but at the moment we're not facilitating the direct measurement of soil carbon using those techs. We're also doing some pretty cool stuff at the back end of our IT systems using things like API as well for people that are sort of in that IT space. I personally find blockchain quite a mysterious being, but I have been told that there are people within the Clean Energy Regulator sort of thinking about how different types of technologies can help us to make sure that the data that we receive is validated. Don, are you across this space?
I'm a plant nerd, not an IT guy, but yeah, you hear it mentioned a lot, and there's clear opportunity there. It's just a matter of how it's integrated, I think. So we have seen attempts to use blockchain to support things like the New South Wales biodiversity offset scheme, for example. I'm not sure how far that actually got. It's been talked about for at least 3 or 4 years now, I think, the integration of blockchain with these sorts of suppliers. And the real benefit would just be a massive reduction potentially in the audit costs. Like, audit costs are huge, and they constrain the scale of project that can be delivered, and they really do limit some activities from participating in the market. So it'd be a great thing to see. In terms of just satellite, like leaving blockchain to one side, satellite information certainly has a role to play already. If you look at the guidance, for example, for reporting on human-induced regen projects, there's a lot of mapping involved in demonstrating that forests are regenerating, that things are working well, and for co-benefits also. The LRF standard, for example, requires annual updates on satellite measured ground cover as part of its co-benefit assessment, and you can use satellite imagery for many other types of approaches to environmental accounting, measuring tree cover change, measuring ground cover, those sorts of things. So that's already well in train.
Thanks so much for that. I really want to thank all of our speakers, so Don Butler, Mel Ford, Brad Kerrin and Beth Adams, for taking your time out today to share all this really useful and stimulating information. I'll just throw briefly to Kate to see if you had anything to add, Kate.
Just a big thank you to our speakers. That was fascinating, and we could have gone on for a lot longer. Big list of questions. But thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all. Much appreciated. And thanks to everyone else who joined as a participant. So we'll see many of you, I hope, later today.